Okay, we're going to briefly go over the Epicurus chapter. So Epicurus represents the particular philosophy known as hedonism. Hedonism is a particular answer to the question, what is the best way to live one's life? Hedonism is the view that one ought to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And insofar as one successfully accomplishes that goal throughout an entire lifetime, one will have lived a good life. So hedonism, again, focuses on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Now, the early part of the reading deals with Epicurus's cosmology. A cosmology is an account or an explanation of the universe. And in fact, his cosmology forms the foundation for his hedonism, as we'll see in a moment. Now, the cosmology that Epicurus adopts is atomism. And he doesn't invent this view. He doesn't come up with this on his own. He borrows atomism from a previous thinker named Democritus. But Epicurus uses atomism as a convenient foundation for his own unique prescriptions for the good life. So what is atomism? According to atomism, the universe is an infinite expanse of atoms and empty space or void. So an atom the term atom comes from a Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable. So an atom is a principle, it's an idea that that matter is indestructible, eternal, and it is made up of these tiny invisible particles that can neither be created nor destroyed, and they cannot be divided. They are the simplest elements in the natural world. So according to atomism, the universe is made up of an infinite number of atoms that combine and separate in an infinite void or space, because you cannot have matter without space, because matter takes up space. So the universe has to be comprised of an infinite number of atoms in an infinite void. So the atoms are the most basic building blocks of all reality. Now, atomism is a form of materialism. Materialism in philosophy, in metaphysics, which deals with the nature of reality. Materialism is the view that the only real beings in existence, the only things that can be truly said to be real, are bodies or matter. So materialist only recognizes bodies as being real. So if you're a materialist, if you're an atomist, you will not take seriously such things as ghosts or spirits or a spiritual soul or God understood as a spiritual being. You will only recognize things that have matter as being real. Nothing else is real for a materialist. Okay, it's important to make that clear at the beginning. So for Epicurus, atomism or materialism generally is a common sense approach to understanding the world, to understanding reality. And what do I mean by that? Well, for Epicurus, he recognizes that the only types of things that we have direct contact with are bodies. We cannot perceive or sense things that are not bodies. Right? Even when we conceive of ghosts, he doesn't actually say this in our chapter, but this idea applies. When we conceive of ghosts, for example, we always give them a material shape. Right? You cannot represent something that's purely spiritual or immaterial except in a material form, right? The fact that bodies exist, we know to be true because common experience shows it to be true. And for Epicurus, there are no other beings but bodies. So that's his point of departure. So everything else, again, ghosts, immaterial souls, spirits, etc., guardian angels, what have you, everything else is the product of an ignorant imagination. It's not true. It does not correspond to what is real. All right? That's his argument. Now, according to atomism, there are two types of bodies. He classifies matter into two types. There are the compounds, which are clusters of two or more atoms. And then there are the atoms themselves, which make up the compounds. Now, what's the fundamental distinction between the two is that with compounds they can be dissolved. They come into being and pass out of being. So they have a finite existence as compounds. Whereas the atoms of which the compounds are made are eternal and unchanging. They have no beginning and no end. Let me give you an example. You are an extremely complex compound of atoms. You're more than just two atoms combined. You are billions and billions of atoms combined, right? And to form one human being, namely you. So there was a time when you as an individual did not exist before you were ever conceived. And then you were conceived, and then you became a fertilized ovum, and you grew inside your mother's womb, and then you were born. You went through infancy, then childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and so forth. Late adulthood, you will go into your old age, decrepitude, and then you will die. And then your identity, your physical structure will cease to be what it is now. And the atoms that comprise your body will be dispersed back into nature, and they will combine with other atoms to form new compounds. And that circle of life and death will occur for all eternity, and it has occurred for all eternity, and there is no beginning and no end to that process. So that's what atomism gives you. So compounds are ephemeral or temporary or mortal or finite. Right? They have a beginning and an end, and then they are no more. Atoms, on the other hand, are eternal, indestructible. They are neither created nor destroyed. Okay, do you see the distinction there? It's a very important distinction to make. Okay, so how do compounds get formed? Well, most of what Epicurus wrote has been lost to us. We have only a few fragments to go by. So he doesn't, in the few fragments that remain, that have been preserved, we are not really given a satisfactory account, a full, complete account of how exactly compounds are formed. We have only a few little bits and pieces that we have to try to make sense of. But in essence, what happens is that for all eternity, atoms have collided with other atoms in the infinite void to form compounds, to form planets, to form solar systems, and within those planets, like Earth, for example, the compounds have combined to form species and inanimate objects and so forth. Now, how exactly, beyond saying that the atoms combine and separate according to the laws of physics, that's all we have to go by. There's nothing more specific than that. I would love to sit down with Epicurus and have a long, drawn-out conversation where he explains in depth how compounds are, how a human being, for example, comes to exist from just the mere chance collisions of atoms in the universe. And I'm sure he would have an answer for me, but and I have no idea what it is. But we have to just kind of rely on what little information we have. But essentially, everything is reducible to the laws of physics. Okay, so this would be compatible, I think, with the argument that evolutionary biologists are partial to, namely that life somehow emerges out of non-living matter. In other words, physics is the first principle, and out of physics we get life, right? Somehow, there's a number of different scenarios, but one argument I've heard is that a lightning bolt struck a morass, a swamp, and ignited the first single-celled organisms. That somehow that life just emerges out of just this spontaneous energy, and then the whole process of cell development and the natural selection gets underway, and then millions and millions of years later, we have a universe populated by all these diverse species, among which is the human being, right? And I think this would be compatible with atomism on some level, because for Epicurus, there is no act of creation, there is no intelligent design. The world was not created according to a rational plan. The human being was not created according to a rational plan by some divine being. On the other hand, rather we are simply just the products of the laws of nature working themselves out. Okay. So even the human soul, according to Epicurus, is corporeal, or is made up of atoms, or is bodily. Right? Remember, he's a materialist, so he does not admit of the possibility of anything existing that is not a body. All right? So even the soul is made up of soul atoms. Right? He says that the soul atoms are round and smooth and finer than the atoms that make up the rest of our body. That's the argument he makes. And the soul basically has the function of providing sensation, feeling. So the soul atoms, according to Epicurus, are diffused or spread throughout the bodily structure. So imagine you're a living human being, and imagine you're like a wet sponge, right? So your body, your tissues, the blood and the organs inside of you, those are the bodily atoms, the atoms that make up your bodily structure. That's the sponge, right? Whereas the soul atoms would be the water in the sponge, right? The wet sponge contains water throughout the whole sponge, right? So the water would be like the soul atoms. That's one image that I think helps to illustrate this point. So the soul atoms are responsible for giving you the power of sensation. Now, what is sensation? Well, think of the 5 senses, right? The ability to perceive, to feel, to smell, to touch, to hear, to see, and so forth, right? Those are all functions of the soul atoms. So insofar as you are able to perceive and feel, you are alive, you are animated, right, by the soul atoms. They are the life force that make you a living creature, right? So an intact corpse would be simply just the bodily structure minus the soul atoms. So for Epicurus, when you die, your soul atoms leave your body. And once they are out of your body, they are no longer capable of giving you sensation. So when you die, it is like being in an eternal dreamless sleep for Epicurus, or for any materialist for that matter. So the soul atoms cannot provide for sensation once they are divorced from the rest of the body. So let me repeat. Death for Epicurus is nothing to be feared because it is painless. Why is it painless? Because when you die, you can no longer feel anything. You cannot feel pleasure or pain. It is like being in a deep coma from which you will never awaken. All right? And this is meant to actually give you some kind of peace of mind. I'll explain that in a second. Okay, again, there is no afterlife. There is no afterlife if Epicurus is right about atomism. If atomism is the the unified field theory for everything in the cosmos, if it explains the nature of all reality, then there is no such thing as an afterlife. Now, in Epicurus's time, there was a great apprehension and great fear among ancient Greeks that they might be punished in the next life, that they might suffer divine retribution in a hellish environment. And that caused them great distress and anxiety. And Epicurus wants to rid people of this, what he considers to be superstitious fear, the fear of divine retribution in some other life, in some hell. So by adopting atomism, which has the appearance of a scientific, enlightened truth, although whether it's true or not remains in dispute. But in any case, by adopting atomism, Epicurus believes we can rid ourselves of this horrible fear of spending an eternity in hell, right? Because again, death is nothing but the deprivation of sensation. Death is like a dreamless eternal sleep, nothing more. It is not painful. It is nothing to be afraid of. Now, for Epicurus, if we can embrace this, this will go a long way in helping us to achieve tranquility, serenity, right? A calmness of soul, which is a kind of pleasure, or rather, perhaps it's better put that it's an absence of pain, right? And that is part of what it means to live a good life for Epicurus, is to be free of anxiety, stress, and fear. And nothing, in his view, creates more unnecessary fear and stress and anxiety than the fear of divine retribution. Now, Epicurus is very critical of the ancient Greek religious views. This might account for why so many of his books have been destroyed or lost to us. He was not very popular among a lot of the traditional guardians of the religious belief system in Greece. And he's very critical of the notion of divine providence. Right? Divine providence refers to the notion that the gods, they are in charge of the cosmos. They intervene on behalf of human beings. They are the protectors and defenders of justice in the universe. And Epicurus wants to get rid of that notion, right? He wants to get rid of any notion of the divine as having any care or concern for humanity, especially with respect to divine retribution. So for Epicurus then, death is simply like an eternal sleep. There are no gods who will reward or punish you. So we have a short time on this earth, and what we need to do is make the best of the time we have, and we do that by maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And the goal is to have serenity of mind, tranquility of soul, right, and a healthy body. On that note, let me make a very important distinction between the two basic kinds of hedonism. The first one is vulgar hedonism, which refers to a commonplace hedonism, the one that is most universally held by people, and then the more enlightened, sophisticated, and philosophic Epicurean hedonism. So vulgar hedonism refers to the vision of the good life according to which one ought to pursue intense bodily pleasures as much as possible. So eating, drinking, sexual gratification, that's really what makes life worth living. That's a very common view, by the way, of the good life. It's a very defective view. It's not a view that is the product of careful reasoning and consideration about human nature. It's a kind of a brutish, animalistic life. And Epicurus points out that the problem with vulgar hedonism is that it leads to a surplus of pain over pleasure in the long term. So a short-term gratification might give you great enjoyment, like drinking a lot or eating, stuffing your face at the Chinese buffet. It might make you feel good while you're doing it, but the next day or the next week, right? Well, you'll have hell to pay, right? You're going to be hungover, or you're going to feel bloated and gross, and you'll gain weight, right? It'll affect your glucose levels. It'll, you get the picture, right? So in the long term, these intense bodily gratifications do more harm than good. So vulgar hedonism is not the way to go, right? If hedonism seeks to maximize pleasure over pain, then the vulgar kind of hedonism is self-defeating. What you want to pursue, Epicurus argues, is a more refined hedonism that recognizes the long-term benefits as opposed to the short-term benefits, right? They're looking for a surplus of pleasure over pain throughout the course of your life. And that requires us to exercise foresight, to anticipate the future consequences of actions we are considering taking in the here and now, right? And do a cost-benefit analysis so as to choose the pleasure or pain that will best bring about a long-term good and minimize pain, right? And he makes this wonderful statement in the reading. He says that not every pleasure is to be chosen, just as not every pain is to be avoided. This is a very brilliant insight, right? Some pleasures ought to be avoided, right? Drinking 10 Jack Daniels on the rocks is a pleasure to be avoided because you're going to feel like hell the next day. And you could, get into an accident, right? Just walking to the bathroom, you could fall and hit your head and bleed to death, right? It's not a pleasure that is in your best interests to indulge in. So look at the long-term consequences, and then you decide if it's worth taking or not. Likewise, some pains ought to be pursued. Not every pain is to be avoided. For example, exercising. Most people, many people don't enjoy exercising. It can be unpleasant. Some people are into it, I get that. But a lot of people really hate it, and they do it because they have to, right? It's a pain. Or, reading a difficult book for a test, or doing your math homework, or whatever, right? These are painful things to an extent, right? Because they're something that are obstacles to be overcome, and it's not fun and pleasant all the time. But we choose these pains. We choose to work out instead of sitting on the couch and eating pizza. Right? We choose to do our math homework as opposed to going to the happy hour bar to hang out with our friends at the risk of failing our math class and not graduating and getting our degree and getting a good job and so on. We choose these pains because they have a long-term benefit to us. So the pain is short-term, whereas the benefit or the pleasure or the good that these pains will give us are long-term. And therefore, since our goal is on the long-term benefit, we choose these specific pains that lead to the long-term benefit. And we avoid those pains and pleasures that give us greater harm than good in the long term. So prudence is the virtue or the activity of mind or the judgment that we exercise that basically tells us which pleasures and which pains ought to be pursued and which ones ought to be avoided. So prudence, again, as I mentioned earlier, prudence has to do with foresight. Foresight is literally the ability to see beforehand, to anticipate the consequences of pains and pleasures, right, with the future consequences. And so you can't be like an animal who simply just, when you put a piece of steak in front of a dog, the dog will eat it. It won't sit and think, maybe I should just have half of it now and half tomorrow because of the cholesterol and the sodium and the fat. No, an animal just simply obeys the law of stimulus and response. But a rational human being is able to exercise prudence and make careful judgments and distinctions and to make a decision based on a cost-benefit analysis of long-term benefit versus long-term disadvantage. And that, Epicurus says, is how we ought to go about the business of living in order to achieve overall well-being. So always, always refer all choice and avoidance to the health of the body, as well as the soul's freedom from disturbance. So for Epicurus, the recipe for the good life is a healthy soul and a healthy body. This is what he means by living in accordance with nature, right? Our bodies only require, a certain amount of nourishment, a certain amount of hydration, sleep, protection from the elements. And that's all. Our nature does not dictate that we have to have luxuries. We don't need self-indulgence. Nature gives us everything that we need to satisfy the basic requirements of health. And philosophy, for Epicurus, gives us what we need to satisfy the basic requirements for tranquility and serenity, namely the atomistic worldview and the vision of the human soul that we get from it, which lead us to discount the fear of divine retribution in hell as a superstition, and thereby live in a manner that is stress-free and anxiety-free. Now, Epicurus was an early proponent of social contract theory, and which states that justice, or morality for that matter, or law, is nothing more than a contract or a promise not to harm or be harmed. So justice is not to be valued for its own sake. It has no meaning or existence in and of itself. Justice for Epicurus exists only insofar as human beings come together to agree on its terms. Justice is merely the mechanism through which human beings can live comfortably and safely and securely among one another. Remember, there are no providential gods in Epicurus. Therefore there are no 10 commandments. There's no heaven or hell where good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. There is no cosmic foundation for right and wrong or good and bad or ethics or morality. So if materialism is true, if atomism is correct, then morality is simply a man-made invention that has no cosmic support for it. It is simply an expedient, a useful tool that we invent in order to govern ourselves effectively, in order to give our lives a certain meaning or purpose. And that's it. He says, justice is nothing more than a man-made agreement. It is conventional, which means made by custom or habit. It does not exist by nature. It is a contract, an agreement. So outside of a legal framework, outside of a human community, a city, a civilization, there is no such thing as justice. Where there is no law, where there are no law books, there is no justice. There is no morality. You'll see something similar to this in Hobbes, in The State of Nature, which we will get to in a later chapter. All right, I wanted to thank you for listening. I hope you found this helpful.